Okay, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit now, and instead of talking about things like schizophrenia and depression, we're gonna actually change topics, like I said, to talking about closed head injuries in general, but with a little bit of a focus on CTE in particular. Of course, one can get closed head injuries in any number of ways besides getting it from sports or getting something as serious as CTE. People who get in bike accidents often can have closed head injuries. People, when they get in car wrecks, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, that you see this sort of telltale pattern at a car wreck where this is actually where someone hits their head on the windshield. A lot of times older individuals will fall in their own home. A lot of times you hear about people falling, breaking their hip, breaking their legs, things like that. But it's also very common that older individuals will have closed head injuries even from just falling in their own home. It actually is interesting. About half of the close to half of all cases of a closed head injury, alcohol is involved in some respect. And this is true when you factor in all age groups. If you actually go to younger individuals, the rates even go up higher for pretty obvious reasons. Now, a lot of times when people talk about these closed head injuries, they usually talk about two different aspects of it: the coup and the counter coup. So the coup is the initial impact side, and the counter coup is the opposite side from when you're sort of having the back and forth mechanics of it. And to try to make that clear, I actually found this little GIF. And if you see here, this physician's holding a kind of mock-up of your brain and a skull, and his hand is going to be what hits his forehead. And if you look at the brain itself, you'll see it kind of wiggle back and forth. So here, let's watch this. Yeah, and so it's that initial impact on the front part, the hand, which would be the coup, and then the bounce back here would be the counter coup. So this is what is referred to as an acceleration deceleration injury. But of course, it can happen on different sides of the head. It doesn't just have to be in the front. So for example, if a baseball player is hit on the side of the head, say while they're batting, the initial coup side can be on one side of the brain, and then the counter coup can be on the other side of the brain, and so forth. But the most common is certainly these frontal regions. And the most common parts of the brain, therefore, that are affected by these are the orbitofrontal cortex and the occipital lobe, which is where visual regions are. So this is why a lot of times you have this thing, you even see it in cartoons, of like people bang their head and they see stars. Where does that come from? It's usually coming from inflammation, spontaneous firing, and activity that's going on from damaging the visual region. And then up until this point in the course, think about all the different OFC, occipital frontal cortex regions, or patients that we've talked about. A lot of those can obviously come from closed head injuries as well. Okay, so what kind of effects does this have on the brain more specifically? So one is referred to as diffuse axonal injuries. Basically, what can end up happening is basically the wiggling of the brain in the head. I know it's not the technical term, but hopefully you all get what I mean by the wiggling. Can lead to neuronal loss in the white matter. So actually, to make this really clear, you can actually see this really apparently with the naked eye if you just look at the corpus callosum over here. Basically, you can kind of think about it as if those connections between all the different parts of the brain, they're pretty fragile wires. It's pretty, fragile microstructures, neuronal structures. And so when there's a lot of violent damage to the brain that causes it to shake within the skull, those violent, fibers that are going between the brain regions, they can really deteriorate pretty easily because they're really rather fragile. Another obvious effect on the brain can be concussions, which we'll talk about in a little bit more depth when we get to CTE. This is the sort of inflammation that can be associated with brain damage when the brain hits the skull very hard. And another very common one, of course, is very unfortunate and can sometimes be deadly. And this is actually usually if people have blunt force trauma to the head and they do end up dying. Usually it's from bleeding. And so they can develop sometimes a thing called a hematoma. A hematoma is just a buildup of blood. I'm sure all of you have had hematomas under your skin. If you have a bruise, that's pretty much just what a bruise is. But what can happen with a hematoma in the brain is actually you can have say you get hit in their forehead, you can have some vessels rupture in the front of your head. There can be a buildup of the blood that stays in your skull. That is the hematoma. And so now you actually have two things that are working against you. One is your brain isn't getting the type of blood that it needs because it's bleeding. So that can be very bad. And then two, actually, as the pool of blood gets bigger and bigger, it can compress the brain. It can put more pressure on the brain. It can cause eventually even some swelling to cause and to occur. And so that itself can lead to another problem in its own right. Now, another thing to note is that TBI, which in this case here stands for traumatic brain injury, also will exacerbate typical aging. So, as you get older, there is natural neural decline in terms of dementias, Alzheimer's, your memory goes, your speed goes, and so forth. Actually, the last lecture in this unit will talk about that. And it's been shown that people who have traumatic brain injuries, those effects will come earlier. So here, on the vertical axis is, say, some sort of hypothetical threshold for a pathology to be clinically diagnosed. So if you cross this line, you're having some sort of diagnosable symptom. And then here on the horizontal axis is just the age. So this is, birth and then, death, let's just say. And so this is just the lifespan. And so this is, of course, like a normal aging curve. As you get older, some of these symptoms can increase. It doesn't really matter what they are, just typical aging symptoms. And then at some point, when you get old enough, they could be clinically diagnosed as, for example, dementia. It's been shown that individuals who had some sort of traumatic brain injury, even much earlier in life, will cross those thresholds much sooner. So for example, this is an individual who had moderate to severe TBI. Maybe they were in a really bad car accident. Maybe they fell and had a really bad concussion. And even though they will recover to a certain extent, you can see that they now cross this threshold much earlier and earlier in life than they would have had they not had any problems whatsoever. You can even see this, and this is going to be a thing we're going to talk about in this section a good amount, especially when we talk about football, is that sometimes it can be a mild or subconcussive traumatic brain injury where you might not even have a fully diagnosable concussion, but people who still have, let's say a handful of these earlier in life, say from playing sports or, riding their bike and falling off their bike several times, you'll see that it crosses that threshold earlier, although it might not be necessarily quite as early as if you have a very moderate or severe type of injury. So speaking of, why don't we talk about traumatic brain injury in sports? And like I said, we'll be mostly focusing on football, but I do really want to make sure to emphasize that it is certainly not the case that TBI is a problem only in football. So men's football is the number one, like if you ranked all the different sports in terms of the frequency which you can see concussive or subconcussive issues, men's football is obviously number one. Number two, might be surprising for some of you to learn, actually is women's soccer. So the second sport after football that has the highest rate of TBI, I believe, is women's soccer. Third is men's ice hockey. So just so you know. But let's talk a little bit about football. I think it's pretty culturally relevant and it's pretty prominent, and it certainly doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon. So I can just give you a little bit more information from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, what the general thinking is about what something like football can do to the brain. And so as we talked about, it's very common that there can be any number of coup and counter coup type of damages. And the thing to keep in mind is that even if you're wearing a helmet, the issue is really about what's going on inside of the helmet. And so even if you have a helmet with lots and lots of padding, if your brain is decelerating very quickly, so say you're running really fast and then your brain comes to a stop very quickly, even if you're surrounded by a lot of padding, your brain inside the skull will still kind of have the opportunity to kind of shake within the fluids of your own skull. That's one of the things, by the way, that makes creating and like solving the concussion problem with helmets very difficult, is it's not necessarily about the helmets or the paddings per se, it's about the sudden deceleration. And so the idea, of course, is that if you have enough padding, you can slow down that deceleration. But again, padding is only usually about yay thick unless you really put people in huge helmets. And so it's just a very difficult problem. And one of the reasons that this has certainly, of course, become much more, prominent when thinking goes, there's a bunch of issues in football, is the change in the height and the weight and the speed and the power of the sport. And so this I found really interesting. This is a distribution of players playing football in the United States in 1923. Oh wait, yeah, sorry, here, let me move that real quick. I'll move it back in a second. Yeah, this is the height and weight distribution in 1923. So, I'm about 6 feet tall. I'm about, let's say 165 pounds or so. So I would be, even back in the 20s, I would have been underweight or too small for the average football player, which I don't think is shocking to any of us. By 1953, you can see that it gets even bigger still. The average player gets taller. The average player gains more weight. And this is now in 2014. You now regularly have people who are 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", and well over 300 pounds. And so when you start having people who are getting that much bigger, that much stronger, even if you have, decent technology in terms of the helmets, it's just that sudden decrease and the sudden deceleration within the skull becomes that much more prominent from bigger, faster, harder hits. Now, of course, the biggest issue that people probably are talking about when it comes to football is this thing that is referred to as CTE, which I have said stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And just to start to give you a sense of what it looks like from a histological standpoint, this is the brain slices of a healthy individual. These are all post-mortem examinations that we're doing here. So this is a very thin slice of what was an otherwise healthy brain. So this is the brain from someone who could have died from heart disease or respiratory failure, something that didn't have to do with the brain. And so you can see these nice, pretty cells here, very, very healthy. This is a football player, and just with the naked eye, you can see the it almost looks like a scab on the brain is how I've always thought about it. You can see it even in these thin microscopic slices as well. And actually something that I didn't mention is this is also very common in boxing. I don't usually talk about boxing because I don't think Amherst doesn't have a boxing team, right? Anywho. This is now if you see two cross sections of two individuals, a healthy individual's brain and a person with advanced CTE. And as you can see, there is just borderline, pretty much universal neurodegeneration. You could tell that the volume is much smaller. The ventricles, if this was still in the cranium, would be much, much smaller. This is, of course, just one brain here and one brain here. Here's another one. Again, you can see it, just a serious decline in overall brain matter. And with that decline in brain matter, you will have obviously symptoms like confusion, memory loss, and so on and so forth, because if there is, say, for example, a decline in, let's look at this one, the hippocampus, which is these two regions down here, and you can't even really make out where the hippocampus is in all of this, you're going to obviously have confusion, you're going to obviously have memory loss and symptoms like that. But actually, CTE has been associated with many, many other things besides just confusion and memory loss. Some of the possible signs are difficulty thinking in general, impulsive behavior, depression, memory loss, difficulty planning or carrying out tasks, even simple tasks like how to get yourself ready in the morning, how to brush your teeth and then get your lunch made and put on your clothes, emotional volatility. Sometimes people who have serious CTE will abuse substances. They can have suicidal ideations and so on and so forth. And the thing I want to make sure to really stress, though, is that it is having these symptoms relative to age matched controls. So it's not just, you have to, when you're talking about things like difficulty thinking or impulsive behavior, it's relative to what. In a situation like this, when I'm talking about it, these sorts of studies, they'll be done comparing, let's say it's high school students who have potentially later been diagnosed with CTE, or college age students, or professional football players, or people in their 50s, 60s, whatever. It's always relative to age matched controls who've been matched, not just for their age, but education levels, socioeconomic status, all these different things. And part of the reason that it has become, of course, very well known in the culture about CTE with football is that there was a very famous study done a couple years ago that found that 110 of the 111 former NFL players that they examined had diagnosable CTE, where you would see slices from healthy individuals, and this is what their brain looks like, whereas with individuals with CTE, you could just see the damage to the brain right there. Now, I should point out, this study has also gotten a tremendous amount of controversy, and I really want to emphasize this because it's not a random sample necessarily. Because the reason I say that is that in order to get these sort of histological slices of a person's brain, the family or the individual has to decide in advance or after the fact to donate their brain to medical science. Now, you could easily imagine that individuals who either have family members or who they themselves have, signs or symptoms of potentially having some sort of neurological deficit, they're going to be very likely to donate their brain. So you can imagine that if you yourself played football and you have some of these symptoms, you might think, hey, I'm going to find this group that does these analyses and I'm going to donate my brain. If you're a healthier individual who, played professional football, let's say, but have no symptoms, you're going to be a lot less likely probably to donate your brain. So this 110 out of 111, it's over 99%. It's difficult to know how exactly to interpret that number in terms of the prevalence of it amongst active football players because of that bias sample. This is actually, I don't usually do this, but this is a great video I found from Vox that actually talks about CTE in depth. So I actually thought we could just watch this together. So let's take a second and just check this out.
There's a good jab on the face.
It's hard to imagine today, but about 100 years ago, boxing was one of the most popular sports in the US. More people went to some championship bouts than could fit into any NFL stadium today. But for boxing, it was all downhill from there. There are a lot of reasons why, but one of them is that a lot of people see the sport as barbaric because it causes brain damage.
After the most murderous beating a man ever took in the ring, and there's
After years of getting hit in the head, many boxers develop dementia and depression as part of a disease called dementia pugilistica. Nowadays, dementia pugilistica has a new name, CTE, and it's not just found in boxers, but in increasing numbers of football players, even causing some people to question the future of the NFL. So people have always known that playing tackle football causes injuries. Okay, I'm gonna play football and maybe I'm gonna break my legs. Maybe I won't be able to run when I'm 50. Players have known that forever, but what we didn't know is that playing tackle football can cause really long-term brain injuries. There's something a lot less sad about a 50-year-old who can't run versus a 50-year-old who can't think.
The things we do to one another, okay? Hell, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just tired and confused right now. That's why I say I can't really, I can't say it the way I want to say it.
Over the past few years, a number of former players have committed suicide after battling depression. Afterwards, they gave their brains to science, and upon examination, they showed telltale signs of CTE. Scientists don't yet have a way of diagnosing CTE for sure besides doing an autopsy. So apart from the 50 deceased former players confirmed to have it, they can only suspect that hundreds more are living with it right now.
9, 7, 8, 4, 3, 2.
9, 7, 8.
For a while, the NFL was completely repressing research. They were telling players that concussions were a relatively safe type of injury to suffer. But with pressure mounting, the league changed course, settling a class action suit for $765 million and pouring money into CTE research. The issue hasn't gone away at all. The NFL has been trying to solve it, and it seems like they're putting genuine efforts into it, but it just might not be possible. In theory, concussed players are no longer allowed to enter games. They've moved the kickoff 5 yards down the field, so a lot more kickoffs become touchbacks, so you don't have the high-speed impacts happen when the kicking team is trying to cover the kick and tackle the player. They've changed the rules in terms of head-to-head hits. On defense, you can't use your head or your helmet as a weapon. If you're a running back, you also can't lead with your head to hit other players' heads. Those are the easiest things to target. They're kind of the lowest hanging fruit. They can't get rid of concussions entirely, those rule changes. Some concussions happen on the most random incidental plays. I mean, you have these huge, fast guys running at high speed, so even if you ban specific types of hits, we're still seeing concussions happen with alarming frequency. There's another problem. Even if they got rid of concussions completely, some of the scientists think that subconcussive hits, so even milder type of hits that we might not even notice watching on TV, also lead to CTE over time. They're still trying to figure that out, but if that were true, that would basically mean that the game of football as we know it is fundamentally unsafe. The NFL is more popular than ever. The Super Bowl gets over 100 million people, so that's a third of the country watching it. And just on a week-to-week basis, more people watch football than any other sport. It's more popular by an order of magnitude. But lots of parents are worried about the safety of the sport. A lot of people have come out and said they wouldn't let their kids play football because of the health risks.
In fact, if I had a son, I would be real leery of him playing.
The number of kids under 16 playing tackle football nationwide seems to be declining, and some state lawmakers have even proposed banning it for kids under 14 entirely. It's unlikely that people are going to just turn off the TV because they realize that sport's unethical. What's going to kill football, if it dies, would be parents not letting the next generation of players put on a helmet.
Got to find a way in this game to help eliminate that play right there, and I don't know how you do it.
All right, so rather than get into the socio-cultural aspects of football, which, are very complicated and not really what I have tremendous expertise in at all, I thought instead what we could talk about are changes to the brain, specifically just to give you a sense of where the research currently stands right now. And unfortunately, it's pretty underdeveloped, so there's not a ton. So I can kind of get you a sense of where it is pretty quickly. One thing I want to point out, and they mentioned this quickly in that video, is that really the only way that you can figure out if someone really has CTE is from doing these post-mortem sort of analyses, these sort of things where you look at the buildup of certain, plaques and other sort of proteins, that sort of degeneration you see. There's currently no way that you can diagnose it in living individuals, although I'll show you a little bit of signs of hope that there is for it. So one thing that has been shown using methods other than those sorts of slices that can at least give you some sort of indication. So this is now with typical MRI type scans, is hippocampus volume. So here, we're not looking at hippocampal activity. We're looking at the size of the hippocampus in general. And we're doing it in a control group, athletes who did not have a concussion and athletes who did have a concussion. So in this particular study, actually, you can think of the athletes as being the football players. And what you would see is something like this, okay? And there's two things that you would want to know. One is that the athletes with a concussion, sure enough, are, much smaller hippocampal volumes than the control group. But two, you still can see, and this is what that man on Vox was talking about, are cases in which individuals who did not have a concussion, but who are still playing football, having subconcussive hits, they can still have a decrease in hippocampal volume. This is part of what makes the sport rather tricky. And, even things like women's soccer, men's ice hockey, or, when people have other sorts of traumatic brain injury, is that they might not necessarily have to rise to the level of a concussion at all for there to still be these long-term impacts. Now, think about it, your hippocampus, think about all the stuff we've learned about memory, think about patients like HM. Hippocampus is a really valuable part of your brain. And so losing hippocampus volume in individuals without concussions is a very serious thing. And actually very, very recently, there was a pretty interesting study actually that was done, mostly I think also in terms of the methodology of how they did it about subconcussive hits in general. So the way they do it actually is they put like these really intense like micro sensors in the football helmets. And so basically at any time, like if you go play a game or have a practice, each one of these sensors, I don't really get how it works, don't ask me, basically will be counting like the number of hits to that location and can count the severity of those hits, like how much force is going to it. So it's basically like an objective way to get, hundreds of measurements per minute or per second or whatever, in terms of the amount of hits to individuals like it. And so this, for example here, this is just showing the distribution of where the hits came from on this particular person. So you can kind of see in this middle vertical axis line, that's where most of the hits are coming from. And what you can do is then you can say like, all right, well, let's look at the number of head hits for individuals, and let's do it specifically though in individuals who are not having any diagnosable concussion. So these are just what we call subconcussive hits or preconcussive hits, okay? So what we're looking at here is the number of hits on the vertical axis. This is just how often you're getting hit. And then here on the, the horizontal axis, the x-axis, it's the postseason minus preseason fractional anisotropy. Fractional anisotropy is just what you measure when you're doing DTI, diffuse tensor imaging. So what this is basically doing is saying like, let's bring you into the scanner before the season starts or before a practice or a game, whatever starts, I guess in this case, it's the season. Let's bring you in, we're gonna bring you in the scanner. We're gonna basically quantify how much white matter you have in your brain using DTI, okay? We're gonna do that. Then we're gonna let you play your season of football. We're gonna count all your hits, and then we're gonna bring you back and we're going to see how much white matter you have now, okay? So it's just before and after with football in the middle. And what you see is a correlation like this, where as the number of hits increases, the amount of fractional anisotropy decreases in the sense that your white matter in effect shrinks with the more hits that you have. And again, these are mostly in individuals who are not having concussive hits. The black dots here are actually representing individuals who were not having any diagnosable concussions. The two red dots were showing actually two individuals who did have concussions at some point during the season, and seems like they fit pretty well on the distribution right there. So this is just an important point because I think a lot of people have the mistaken impression that, oh, so long as you don't get a concussion, it's fine, or, I'll let my kid do some dangerous sport. And it can be anything. It'd be, again, like I said, hockey, boxing, soccer, I don't know, riding around on their skateboard, BMX, whatever. So long as they don't get a concussion, they're fine. It's like, oh no, actually it turns out that these regular, smaller subconcussive hits can still be doing pretty long lasting damage. So the great thing would be then if you had a way to detect CTE in individuals who are, living and who have not yet started showing symptoms, or who have not yet really, who've not passed away. And so you're not doing this sort of histological exams where you look at their post-mortem brain. So can you detect CT in the living? No, but there's a little bit of hope, although it's super preliminary and controversial. I'll at least tell you about it. One is a specific type of scan that people do that is tracking a thing called DPA713. And DPA713 is a particular protein that in the brain has been associated with brain damage and repair. The idea being that what's going on is that DPA713 is when it's present, that is a sign that there's been damage to a part of the brain and the brain is trying to repair itself. And so if you look at the top, you can see a healthy control. There might be some, repair type of things going on. You can see, 2 hotspots, for example, here in the hippocampus. Maybe that's associated with age-related decline and trying to, keep them happy and healthy. Whereas when you look at a former NFL player, you can see much more DPA 713. Similarly, people have been trying to figure out ways to do this with PET scans. And what they try to do is see if they can use these radioactive agents that will bind to the kind of proteins that build up in the brain in general. So when you look at individuals who have CTE, you can see it's like I said, scabs in the brain. What's going on here is basically that as your brain gets damaged and damaged and damaged, there's these buildup of these proteins called tau proteins that have like they're like a physical substance. You can really even see them under a microscope. So that's what, for example, you're seeing in these 2 plots over here. And so it actually turns out that people are trying to figure out a way that you can get the radioactive tracers in a PET scan, which is just like an older version of fMRI to a degree, to specifically bind with those proteins. Because the idea is if you can get the tracer to bind with the proteins, then if they light up, that means that those tau proteins are there. This is extremely preliminary. It's very controversial. You can kind of look at this and be like, okay, maybe it's works for some of these people here, but maybe I think there's been a lot of cases where people have found like, oh, it doesn't work that well. You could have 5 other NFL players that when you do these scans, it appears as if they don't have CT or any of those tau proteins. But when you do a histological exam of their brain, you can see that they really did. So these are the types of things people are working on. There's no blood test. There's no single scan. You can't even really necessarily look at things, for example, like hippocampal volume, because, for example, say this is your football player right there, and their hippocampus seems pretty normal. It's like, well, they don't seem like they have it. So hippocampal volume isn't great. This person doesn't even play sports and they have a lower hippocampal volume. So there's no scan that you can use, and these sorts of things looking at genes and proteins and radioactive tracers, they're just not there yet, even though people are trying to develop them. The hope being that if you have these, you could even have high school kids, middle school kids, that if you needed to, you could scan their brains and you could determine whether or not they were developing, pretty serious CTE even before they have any diagnosable symptoms. Okay, so let's take a little break now, and we'll come back for our last lecture, which we'll talk about dementia and Alzheimer's. There'll be a lot of thematic similarity between dementia, Alzheimer's, and CTE, but I'll get into that in a second. But why I'm going from, athletes in the, peak physical condition to older individuals, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as you see that there's pretty similar age-related and trauma-related decline. And that's what we'll do in the next section.